The Walking Corpse King, how Henry VIII's festering wounds made servants run away in terror. The year was 1546, and something was rotting in the Palace of Whitehall. It wasn't the food left too long in the kitchens, nor the refuse from the stables carried on London's perpetual wind. No, this putrid stench emanated from the very heart of the Tudor court, from the king himself. Henry VIII, once the golden prince of Renaissance England, had become something that would make plague doctors recoil in horror. His massive frame, now weighing nearly 400 pounds, was supported by mechanical contraptions that groaned under the burden. But it wasn't his obesity that sent seasoned courtiers fleeing from royal chambers with handkerchiefs pressed desperately to their faces. It was the wounds. 2 gaping ulcers, each the size of a man's fist, had opened on the king's legs and refused to heal. For over a decade, these festering craters had leaked pus, blood, and rotting flesh with such persistence that the very air around Henry had become toxic. The sweet, cloying smell of decay followed him like an invisible crown, announcing his presence long before his labored breathing could be heard echoing through the corridors. Servants drew lots to determine who would dress the king each morning, for approaching those putrid wounds was considered a form of punishment worse than the stocks. Some claimed the stench could be detected from 3 rooms away. Others swore that the king's bedchambers had to be abandoned for hours after he left, windows thrown open and herbs burned frantically to make the air breathable again. This was no ordinary monarch's decline into old age and infirmity. This was the spectacular disintegration of a man who had declared himself God's representative on earth, whose body had become a walking advertisement for mortality's cruel mockery of earthly power. Chapter 1. The flesh betrays the crown. The transformation had been gradual, then suddenly catastrophic. In 1536, during a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace, Henry VIII's horse had fallen on him, crushing the 34-year-old king beneath its massive weight. For 2 hours, he lay unconscious while his court held its collective breath, certain they were witnessing the end of the Tudor dynasty. When Henry finally awakened, something fundamental had changed. The athletic young king, who had danced until dawn and hunted deer on foot, began to complain of persistent pain in his legs. At first, his physicians dismissed it as typical injuries from such a severe accident. They could not have imagined they were witnessing the first symptoms of what would become a decade-long nightmare of flesh and bone rebellion. By 1540, small sores had appeared on both of the king's legs, just above the ankles. His doctors, trained in medieval medicine and superstition, applied their standard treatments: leeches to drain bad blood, poultices of herbs and animal dung, and prayers to various saints known for their healing powers. The wounds, unimpressed by royal privilege or divine intervention, began to spread. "Bring me mirrors," Henry would command his physicians, demanding to see the progress of his legs healing. But there was no progress, only regression into something that resembled a horror from Dante's Inferno more than a king's limbs. The ulcers grew larger, deeper, angrier. What had begun as thumbnail-sized sores expanded into craters that seemed to tunnel toward the bone. The flesh around the wounds became black and green, taking on the appearance of rotting meat left too long in summer heat. Worse still, pieces of dead tissue would slough off without warning, sometimes falling from beneath the king's elaborate stockings during formal court ceremonies. Dr. William Butts, the king's chief physician, documented the wounds with clinical precision that barely concealed his horror. His Majesty's lower extremities present with ulcerations of considerable magnitude, discharging matter of most foul character and resistant to all therapeutic interventions attempted thus far. What Butts couldn't bring himself to record was how the king's own body had declared war on itself. The wounds had developed their own ecosystem of decay, harboring infections that medieval medicine had no power to combat. The constant drainage meant that bandages had to be changed multiple times throughout the day, a process that required servants to approach close enough to smell not just the wounds themselves, but the sweet, nauseating odor of flesh literally rotting away while still attached to a living body. Henry's response to his body's betrayal was characteristic of his personality: denial, rage, and paranoia. He blamed his physicians for incompetence, his servants for carelessness, and his enemies for possible poisoning. Never did he consider that his own lifestyle, the massive consumption of rich foods, the sedentary existence that followed his accident, the stress of constantly fearing assassination, might be contributing to his body's revolt. The king, who had once prided himself on his physical prowess, now required assistance for the most basic functions. Servants had to help him dress, bathe, and eventually even walk. But approaching Henry VIII meant enduring an assault on the senses that tested human endurance to its limits. Chapter 2: The Servant's Nightmare. Margaret Hornby had served in royal households for 15 years, but nothing had prepared her for the morning she was assigned to help dress King Henry VIII. The year was 1544. And the king's condition had deteriorated to the point where even hardened palace staff whispered prayers before entering his chambers. The assignment came by lot, a system devised out of necessity when several servants had simply refused to approach the king, accepting dismissal rather than endure what they privately called the king's rot. Margaret drew the short straw on a grey February morning, and her fellow servants looked at her with the same pity normally reserved for condemned prisoners. "Just breathe through your mouth," whispered Agnes, an older woman who had survived 3 previous encounters with the royal wounds. "And whatever you do, don't look directly at his legs when Thomas removes the bandages. I've seen grown men faint." The walk to the king's chambers felt like a funeral procession. Margaret carried fresh linens, clean bandages, and a small pouch of aromatic herbs that she prayed might provide some protection against the assault that awaited her. The other servants, Thomas the valet, who would actually handle the wound dressing, and William the page, who would assist with the king's clothing, walked in grim silence. They could smell it before they reached the door. The odor hit them like a physical wall 20 feet from the king's chambers. It was a complex bouquet of horrors: the sweet smell of rotting meat, the sharp tang of infected discharge, and underneath it all, a mustiness that spoke of flesh dying while still attached to a living body. Margaret instinctively pressed her sleeve to her nose, but the fabric provided no barrier against the olfactory assault. Inside the chamber, King Henry VIII lay propped up in his massive bed, his bulk covered by expensive linens that could not disguise the reality of his condition. His face, once handsome enough to charm wives and courtiers alike, had become bloated and mottled, but it was his legs, visible beneath the sheet, that commanded attention like a horrific magnet. "Approach," commanded the king, his voice still carrying the authority that had once launched 1,000 ships and changed the religious landscape of Europe. But there was something new in his tone, a desperate edge that spoke of a man who knew his own body was betraying him in the most fundamental way possible. Thomas, the senior valet, stepped forward with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to compartmentalize horror as a survival mechanism. He began unwrapping the bandages that covered the king's legs, and Margaret watched in fascination and revulsion as yards of stained linen came away from the royal limbs. The wounds, when finally revealed, defied description. They were not simply sores or cuts, but craters in the king's flesh that seemed to tunnel toward the bone. The edges were black and green, clearly dead tissue that clung to the living flesh like some macabre decoration. From the depths of these ulcers came a steady discharge of pus and blood that had stained the bandages yellow-brown and filled the room with its nauseating sweetness. But it was the smell that broke Margaret's composure. As fresh air hit the exposed wounds, the full force of the decay struck her like a physical blow. The odor was so intense it seemed to coat the inside of her mouth and nose, creating a taste as well as a smell. She turned away, retching, and saw that William the page had gone completely pale and was swaying on his feet. "Stand fast!" Henry roared, his voice carrying both royal command and desperate humiliation. "I am still your king by God's blood." The cleaning process that followed was a carefully choreographed dance of revulsion and duty. Thomas had to remove not just the soiled bandages, but pieces of dead flesh that had sloughed away from the wounds overnight. These fragments, some as large as coins, had to be carefully extracted with tweezers while the king gritted his teeth and cursed everyone within earshot. "Gently, you ham-fisted fool," Henry snarled as Thomas worked. "Would you excavate a grave with such carelessness?" The fresh bandages, soaked in various herbal concoctions and perfumed waters, provided only temporary relief. Within hours, they too would be saturated with discharge, and the process would need to be repeated. The king required this attention 3 times daily, meaning that his personal servants lived in a constant state of dread, knowing that their next shift might bring them face to face with the royal wounds. Word of the servants' ordeal spread through the palace with the speed of plague rumors. Stories circulated of maids fainting in corridors after catching an unexpected whiff of the king's presence, of pages vomiting in castle corners after assisting with his care, of even hardened soldiers assigned to guard duty requesting transfers to avoid the assault on their senses. The psychological toll on the palace staff was immense. Many began to see the king's condition as divine punishment, a sign that God himself was displeased with Henry's break from Rome and his treatment of his wives. Others whispered that the devil had marked the king's flesh as his own. These were dangerous thoughts that could lead to charges of treason, but they spread nonetheless through the servant quarters like a contagion of whispered horror. Chapter 3. The King's War Against His Own Body. By 1545, Henry VIII had declared war on his own flesh, and like most of his conflicts, it was a campaign marked by brutality, desperation, and eventual defeat. The king, who had once commanded armies across Europe, now found himself locked in a battle he could neither win nor abandon: the fight against his own decomposing body. His daily routine had become a military operation designed around the management of his festering wounds. Each morning began with what palace staff privately called the siege, the complex process of unwrapping, cleaning, treating, and rebandaging the ulcers that had taken permanent residence in his legs. Henry approached this daily ordeal with the same strategic mind that had once planned the invasion of France, issuing detailed commands about bandage tension, herbal mixtures, and the precise timing of each intervention. The left wound requires additional pressure on the southern edge, he would instruct his physicians with the same authority he had once used to direct battlefield tactics. and increase the concentration of honey in the eastern poultice by half again. But unlike his military campaigns, this war offered no possibility of victory, only the grim mathematics of managed decay. The wounds had achieved a kind of terrible equilibrium, neither healing nor killing him, but maintaining a constant state of putrefaction that made his very existence a testament to the body's capacity for prolonged rebellion. Dr. Wendy, one of the few physicians brave enough to examine the wounds closely, documented the king's condition with clinical precision. The ulcerations present as irregular cavities extending to a depth of approximately 2 inches, with necrotic tissue visible along the borders and continuous discharge of purulent material. The surrounding flesh exhibits characteristics consistent with chronic infection and poor circulation. What the good doctor couldn't capture in his careful medical language was the psychological horror of watching a living man slowly rot from the inside out. The wounds had developed their own grotesque personality, seeming to pulse and weep with a rhythm independent of the king's heartbeat. Some days they would appear slightly better, giving Henry false hope that his battle was turning in his favor. Other days they would seem angrier, more aggressive, as if his own flesh had developed a malevolent intelligence dedicated to his destruction. Henry's response to his body's betrayal revealed the full paranoid complexity of his character. He became convinced that his condition was the result of enemy action, perhaps poison administered by papal agents or witchcraft practiced by supporters of his discarded wives. He ordered investigations into the loyalty of his physicians, convinced that someone was deliberately sabotaging his treatment to ensure his wounds never healed. "Bring me the cook who prepared yesterday's beef," he commanded, during one particularly bad episode when his wounds seemed to be discharging more than usual. I would question him about the seasonings used. There are those who would see their king weakened through corruption of his very sustenance. The king's apartments were transformed into a bizarre combination of royal court and medical facility. Tables that had once held documents of state now supported an arsenal of surgical instruments, herbal preparations, and experimental treatments gathered from across Europe. Henry consulted with physicians, barber surgeons, herbalists, and even suspected witches in his desperate search for a cure that would restore his body to royal respectability. One particularly disturbing innovation was the king's development of what he called wound schedules, detailed charts tracking the daily variations in discharge, odor intensity, and pain levels for each ulcer. He assigned numerical values to his agony, creating a quantified hell that he reviewed each evening, like a general studying casualty reports from the front lines of his personal war. The right wound registers a 7 in morning discharge, but drops to a 4 by evening prayers. He would note with the same attention to detail he had once devoted to tax collection and military logistics. The left maintains consistent putrefaction at level 6 throughout the day. We must adjust the battle strategy accordingly. The most heartbreaking aspect of Henry's condition was his persistent belief that victory was possible, that the right combination of treatments would restore him to health and vindicate his claim to divine favor. He tried everything: ground pearls mixed with virgin's urine, poultices made from the hearts of freshly killed doves, even experimental procedures involving the application of live leeches directly to the wound beds. Each new treatment began with royal optimism and ended in bitter disappointment. The wounds seemed to mock his efforts, sometimes appearing to improve slightly, just long enough to raise his hopes before returning to their steady state of putrid rebellion. By winter 1545, even Henry's iron will began to crack under the weight of his flesh's stubborn refusal to submit to royal command. Yet he continued to fight, because surrendering to his body's decay would mean acknowledging that he was, after all, merely mortal, an admission that would undermine not just his authority, but his entire understanding of his place in God's plan for England. Chapter 4. The Palace of Whispered Horrors. Hampton Court Palace, once the jewel of Henry VIII's architectural ambitions, had by 1546 transformed into something resembling a medieval charnel house crossed with a royal residence. The king's deteriorating condition had infected the very atmosphere of court life, creating an environment where luxury and revulsion existed in grotesque harmony. The physical modifications to accommodate Henry's condition told their own story of decline. Corridors that had once showcased tapestries depicting his military victories now featured strategically placed vessels containing aromatic herbs and burning incense, desperate attempts to combat the miasma that followed the king wherever his mechanical chair could carry his rotting bulk. Windows that had been sealed to preserve royal privacy were now kept permanently open, regardless of weather, in a futile effort to prevent the accumulation of what courtiers euphemistically called the king's atmosphere. Lady Margaret Douglas, Henry's own niece, left a private account that survived in her personal papers. The court has become a place where luxury and horror dance together in ways that would make Dante weep. We speak in whispers, not from conspiracy, but because loud voices might draw his attention, and with it, the necessity of approaching close enough to smell the death that clings to his living flesh. The courtiers who remained developed elaborate strategies for survival. They learned to position themselves strategically during audiences, taking advantage of cross breezes and architectural features that might provide relief from the olfactory assault. Some took to carrying small sachets of strong-smelling herbs, while others simply held their breath for as long as possible during necessary interactions with their sovereign. But it was the psychological atmosphere that proved most corrosive. The king's obvious physical decline created a constant undercurrent of tension as nobles tried to balance their revulsion with their political survival. Everyone could see that Henry was dying by degrees, his body publicly demonstrating the lie of divine kingship. Yet acknowledging this reality, even through facial expressions, could be interpreted as treason. Ambassador Eustace Chapuis, representing the Holy Roman Emperor, wrote to his master, "I have witnessed the aftermath of battles, seen men die of plague and pox, but nothing has prepared me for the horror of watching a king's body rebel against his mind's commands." His Majesty's condition has created an atmosphere of barely contained hysteria among his courtiers, who must pretend not to notice that their sovereign smells like a battlefield 3 days after the fighting has ended. The dining rituals became particularly surreal. Henry still insisted on formal court meals, where hundreds of nobles would gather to watch him consume massive quantities of food, while his wounds continued their steady discharge beneath the table. The contrast between the elaborate presentations of roasted meats and fine wines and the ever-present stench of decay created a sensory experience that tested the limits of human endurance. Servants assigned to serve the king's meals developed their own coping mechanisms. Some would apply strong-smelling oils to the insides of their nostrils, creating a barrier against the worst of the odor. Others learned to serve from unusual angles, approaching from upwind whenever possible. A few simply requested reassignment, accepting demotion rather than continue subjecting themselves to the daily horror of royal service. The king's insistence on maintaining normal court activities despite his condition created countless moments of black comedy. During one memorable evening entertainment, a group of musicians performing for Henry were positioned too close to his chair. The lutenist, a young man named Christopher, became visibly ill during his performance, but continued playing even as tears streamed down his face from the assault on his senses. When Henry noticed the musician's distress, he assumed it was emotional response to the beauty of the music and rewarded him with additional gold, completely oblivious to the real source of the young man's tears. The psychological toll extended beyond mere disgust. Many courtiers began to experience what we might now recognize as symptoms of trauma. Sleep disturbances became common as people tried to purge the memory of the king's smell from their minds. Some developed obsessive bathing habits, as if they could wash away the contamination of proximity to royal decay. Others found themselves unable to eat meat for weeks after attending formal dinners, the association between the smell of cooked flesh and the king's putrid wounds proving too strong to overcome. Perhaps most disturbing was the way Henry's condition affected perceptions of monarchy itself. For generations, English subjects had been taught that kings ruled by divine right, that royal blood carried God's blessing and protection. But here was their sovereign, rotting alive in front of their eyes, his flesh providing daily evidence that royal privilege offered no protection against the most fundamental realities of human mortality. Whispered conversations in corridors began to touch on dangerous theological questions. If God truly favored King Henry, why would he allow such visible suffering? Was this divine punishment for the king's break with Rome, his treatment of his wives, his execution of so many subjects? These were treasonous thoughts that could lead to death, but they spread through the court like an infection, carried on the same air that bore the stench of the king's wounds. The palace that had once symbolized the glory of Tudor rule had become a monument to the fragility of human flesh, a daily reminder that neither power nor wealth could prevent the body from choosing its own path toward dissolution. Chapter 5. The Final Corruption. January 1547 marked the beginning of the end, though Henry VIII's body had been rehearsing for this finale for years. The king's condition had progressed beyond the merely horrific into realms that challenged the very concept of what it meant to be alive. His wounds, now more than a decade old, had achieved a kind of terrible permanence, becoming not just medical conditions, but integral parts of his identity as a monarch whose flesh had become a public spectacle of decay. The morning of January 15th brought what would become known among the palace staff as the Great Rupture. Thomas Alsop, the most senior of the king's body servants, was performing the routine morning cleaning when the unthinkable happened. The largest of Henry's leg wounds, which had been gradually deepening for months, suddenly gave way, revealing what appeared to be exposed bone beneath the rotting flesh. "Sweet Jesus, preserve us," Alsop whispered, and immediately crossed himself before remembering that such Catholic gestures were now treasonous. The sight that greeted him defied not just medical understanding, but human comprehension. The wound had become a crater so deep that candlelight disappeared into its depths, while the surrounding flesh hung in blackened tatters like some macabre decoration. The discharge that followed was unlike anything previously witnessed in the king's long battle with his own body. Instead of the usual pus and blood, there came a flow of fluid so foul and thick that it seemed to move with its own malevolent purpose. The smell, already legendary throughout the palace, intensified to the point where even Henry himself began to retch. the first time in years that his own condition had overwhelmed his ability to endure it. "Bring me mirrors," the king commanded, his voice weaker than anyone had ever heard it. "I would see what God has wrought upon his anointed king." When the mirrors were positioned to show him the full extent of his wounds, Henry VIII stared in silence for nearly 10 minutes. Those present would later swear they watched something die in the king's eyes. Not his body, which had been dying by degrees for years, but his spirit, his fundamental belief in his own divine protection. Dr. Owen, the physician brave enough to remain closest to the king during this crisis, later wrote, "I observed His Majesty confront the full reality of his condition and witnessed what I can only describe as the death of his illusions." The man who had claimed God's personal favor was forced to acknowledge that his flesh told a different story entirely. The physical deterioration accelerated dramatically. Within days, Henry could no longer be moved from his bed without the risk of his wounds tearing open further. The mechanical chairs and walking aids that had enabled his mobility became obsolete overnight as his body finally surrendered to the rot that had been consuming it from within. But it was the psychological collapse that proved most remarkable. The king, who had terrorized England for decades, began to show signs of what appeared to be genuine remorse. Though whether this was spiritual awakening or simply the effect of infection on his brain remained unclear. He began calling for priests. Protestant ones, to be sure, but priests nonetheless, and spoke repeatedly of his need to make account for his actions. "I have been a most vile sinner," he confessed to Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who had rushed to the king's bedside. "My flesh bears witness to God's judgment upon my cruelty, my pride, my rejection of his holy church. Look upon these wounds and see what becomes of kings who set themselves above divine law." The smell in the king's chamber during his final weeks became so overwhelming that even the priests struggled to remain long enough to offer spiritual comfort. Multiple relay teams of servants were established to ensure that someone could always be present, but individual shifts were limited to 30 minutes to prevent complete physical breakdown from the olfactory assault. Henry's death, when it finally came on January 28, 1547, was almost anticlimactic. His body had been dying so publicly and for so long that the actual cessation of breath seemed like a mere formality. But even in death, his flesh continued its rebellion. The servants charged with preparing his body for burial discovered that the decay had progressed so far that traditional embalming was impossible. The wounds that had tormented him for over a decade continued to discharge even after his heart stopped beating, as if his flesh was determined to have the final word in their long conflict. The undertakers, hardened professionals who had dealt with plague victims and battlefield corpses, found themselves completely overwhelmed by the challenge of preparing Henry VIII's remains for public viewing. "We cannot make this body presentable for royal funeral rites," admitted Master John Harrison, the chief undertaker. "The corruption has progressed beyond our art's ability to disguise or contain." The solution was unprecedented. Henry VIII became the first English monarch to be sealed immediately in lead-lined coffins, with strict orders that the body was never to be viewed again. Even in death, the king, who had demanded absolute visibility and control over his image, was forced into hiding by the very flesh that had once carried his imperial ambitions. The irony was not lost on those who had suffered through the final years of his reign. The man who had executed subjects for failing to acknowledge his divine authority had been brought low by his own body's refusal to submit to royal command. His flesh had become the ultimate Protestant, rejecting papal authority, royal decree, and divine pretension with equal determination. Conclusion: the corpse that conquered a king. Henry VIII died as he had lived his final decade, in rebellion against his own flesh, but with his flesh ultimately victorious. The king, who had claimed divine authority over the bodies and souls of his subjects, discovered that he possessed no sovereignty over his own decomposing form. His wounds, those faithful companions of his final years, had taught him and his kingdom a lesson in mortality that no amount of royal propaganda could contradict. The legacy of Henry's physical collapse extended far beyond his personal suffering. His courtiers, servants, and subjects had witnessed something unprecedented in English royal history: the complete destruction of the mystique of divine kingship through the simple, undeniable evidence of rotting flesh. No amount of ceremony, wealth, or power could disguise the fact that their sovereign was literally falling apart before their eyes, piece by putrid piece. The servants who survived their encounters with the royal wounds carried their trauma for life. Many left detailed accounts that provide our most vivid window into the reality of Henry's final years. Not the sanitized version found in official histories, but the visceral truth of a man whose body became his most implacable enemy. Their testimonies remind us that power, no matter how absolute, offers no protection against the fundamental realities of human mortality. Perhaps most significantly, Henry VIII's spectacular physical decline marked the beginning of a new understanding of monarchy itself. Never again would English subjects accept quite so completely the fiction of royal divinity, having witnessed too clearly how thoroughly divine favor could abandon even the most powerful of kings. His festering wounds became a kind of democratic equalizer, proving that beneath the crowns and ceremonies, kings possessed the same vulnerable flesh as their humblest subjects. The walking corpse king, as history should remember him, achieved in death what he had never managed in life: complete honesty about the human condition, delivered through the irrefutable testimony of his own decomposing body.